Sorry for looking at my hand. Here, what else can you look at? Here, you can look at my kitchen table. Well, some of you don't want to look at my nude photos over my shoulder, but I like this chair. It's in the right place. I'm always putting the photos over my shoulder. See? Subconsciously, I want to show off. I'm a nudist. I want to show off. So I have to keep correcting my video camera angle just for your benefit. Anywho, sometimes it has to be repeated over and over again because the people making comments, and they're all helpful, and I love all of them. I love all of you. It's just, it's necessary to keep repeating this because it's an old notion that Newman started and has to be corrected if we're going to look at Newman's motor accurately. And the issue, I mean, is the issue of gyroscopes, the little gyroscopes inside the coil, the massive copper coil. And those are two fallacies that we have to correct, but the one I want to focus on is the little gyroscopes. That is nothing new. Anybody who understands electrical theory and how to analyze the tracings on an oscilloscope of an AC sine wave, they know that what they're looking at is not what they're looking at. They're looking at a two-dimensional imaging of a three-dimensional waveform. That three-dimensional waveform is the spiral shape of the DNA, the spiral shape of a coil, a slinky coil. You know the slinky toy? Look it up. It was big in my day when I was a little kid. Send it down a stairway and it keeps robotically taking steps all on its own, unless it deflects to one side or another or just stops. But it's a very cool little toy. Anyway, a coil, if you look at it from the side, is a sine wave, and if you flattened it and painted it, traced it, it would, on a two-dimensional frame of reference, it would be a sine wave. That's, and then let's go back to Michael Faraday. A moving magnetic field, if it passes through a wire, creates the movement of current, but it also imparts the shape of that current into the wire, transferred from the shape of the moving magnetic field in space surrounding that wire. And in the case of a rotating magnetic field, the current imparted to that piece of wire is a rotating shape of current. So when the AC sine wave of current goes down the transmission wire, the oscilloscope may make it look like a sine wave, but in reality it's a spiral. In fact, at very high frequencies and high voltages, as Tesla loved to fool around with, that spiraling current going down the wire actually leaves the wire and skips along the surface. It's called the skin effect. And even skips on top of the insulation of that wire and rides along the outer surface of that insulation. It's so high in value that it leaves the wire. It exits the wire and dances along the surface of the insulation of that wire. But it's still a spiral shape regardless. In fact, this spiral phenomenon is well known in the audio industry. I bought wire some years ago that's aluminum on the inside and a thin veneer of electroplated copper on the outside, and then comes the insulation. Now, aluminum has greater resistance anyway, and so that encourages the semi-skin effect of the spiraling current to leave the center of the wire and go to the outer edge of that wire, just underneath the insulation of that wire, and spiral around there within the copper electroplated sheathing that goes on top of the aluminum core. So this phenomenon is known. You know, an AC sine wave is a rotating shape, waveform shape, of the current going down the wire. But Newman didn't know that, and because Newman has been isolated, just like his coil manages to do between the two dipoles of his motor, but I'm getting ahead of myself, he was so isolated in his understanding, because he didn't even have much of a grade school education, let alone a specialty, going to college. So he had to make up this song and dance about little gyroscopes inside of his copper coil. And the only way that copper coil could do its job properly in the circuit overall was to be massive. It had to be massive. because it had to isolate the two poles of his dipole that he was creating. One was the amperage-oriented, high amps, low volts oriented energy within his spinning bar magnet's magnetic field that it was creating around itself, of an AC sine wave, a spiraling shape. And the other was the chopped up DC voltage coming from his battery pack, chopped up by the commutator into square waves with a 50% duty cycle. I'm leaving out the self-short part because with my circuit is well developed enough that I don't need a self-shorting of the coil for 20% of its duty cycle towards the last 80 to 100% of that duty cycle. I don't need that. It actually performs better without it. But he's blending two different waves, a square DC wave and a sine wave shaped AC wave, in the middle in his coil. But he's also creating an isolation transformer with the help of that coil being electrically separated from the magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet. And that's two different entities that have no direct coupling, no hard coupling between them. It's a loose coupling in the sense that they're isolated from each other. Now, it's also a loose coupling in the sense that in order for my simulation to work at maximum potential and create negative current in the battery, indicating that the batteries are not going to be drained, they won't necessarily be charged. That's dependent on the voltage of the coil, and I keep that down. So the batteries in my simulations never get charged, but they never get drained either. What was I? I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so the coil is massive, and it's acting as a pickup coil, like a pickup coil on an acoustic guitar on stage. Connected to the wires of that guitar, because it's taking, those pickup coils convert. If you electrify the wires, actually, no, forget about the acoustic guitar. Let's just stick with an electric guitar. The electric, the wires of an electric guitar are electrically energized, so they become their own coil to convert mechanical vibration, kind of like a piezoelectric effect, into signals of a low energy level that are sent to the amplifier, amplified, and then we get to hear it. Well, his massive coil does something similar. It picks up the signal, the AC signal, from the spinning magnetic field. It blends it with the chopped up square wave of voltage coming from the battery pack and blends them inside itself and creates a relatively moderately high impedance due to the fact that it's mixing stuff in such a way that it would not make for being a good electric generator. It's lousy as an electric generator, but it's great as a mechanical device creating torque, and that's what his device does. It's a Bessemer wheel on electrical steroids, because it's merely a mechanical device. It is not an electrical device in terms of what it puts out. He gives it a little bit of mechanical input with his arm when he starts the magnet rotating. But that's it. That's the only energy that he puts into the system that's not already there, because he's not draining the batteries. So he's certainly not getting any current from the batteries, nor any watts, because it's slightly negative. It's due to the slightly negative amps. It's a lot of volts that are leaving the batteries, but there's a slight amount of current going back into them because of how this device can blend those energies and create that result. Well, my simulation also causes me to see that the voltage leaving the AC voltage source that I have to use to supply the simulated spinning magnetic field, that also becomes negative and slightly elevated too. Just like in the case of the voltage leaving his battery pack. Well, no, in my simulation it's actually depressed. It's not 300 volts negative. It's, I forget what it is, but it's like millivolts or something. It's really small, but it's negative. But the volts leaving or being produced for the production of the AC sine wave in my simulation of the spinning magnetic field those volts are very small to begin with. They're 255 microvolts positive as they leave the energy source. But despite the fact that they're designed to do that, that's not what ends up happening. What ends up happening is that negative 300 or 400 microvolts, let's say 4 or 5, appears on that energy source. So it's been modified by its interaction with the rest of the circuit, and now it's got negative volts, still in the microvolt range, but slightly elevated, appearing on that energy source, supplying the voltage for the spinning magnetic field of my simulated spinning bar magnet, which is kind of interesting. But still, it's microvolts. And so what really happens, what we see, is 60 kiloamps, I believe they're positive, appearing in that spinning magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet. And that's a lot of amps, because we don't get to see that much amps appearing at the battery pack. All we see is 1.5 milliamps negative. It's like nothing. So, but we have a dipole in which we have high amps, low volts within the context of the spinning magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet, and we have high volts, low amps within the context of the DC-oriented battery pack. And then we have the coil in between, blending the two within itself, creating a complex waveform, and isolating the two poles of this dipole that are sending it these two different versions of energy, creating a relatively high impedance within that coil. But because it's not an electrical device, it doesn't matter. The impedance is electrical, it's not mechanical. Now, the coil does heat up. Dr. Hastings in chapter 6 of Newman's book says so. The coil heats up. But when you have a magnetic field that's high amps, low volts, it's definitely going to be endothermic, and it literally helps to cool the coil. Pretty good. So you get this oppositional forces in which the coil is exothermic and the spinning magnetic field is endothermic, and they're within each other's context. You know, the magnetic field of the coil blends with the magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet, and so the spinning bar magnet is able to cool the coil. Pretty cool. Pun intended. Let's see. So the gyroscopes are simply a manifestation of an AC sine wave. That's all it is, showing up temporarily in the coil so long as the bar magnet keeps spinning. Once it stops, the little gyroscopes disappear. Now, Newman said, well, they re-enter the coil, and when they appear, they exit the coil and make up the field of the coil. Okay, fine. Whatever. But it's originating not from the coil, though. It didn't leave the coil. It's actually entering the coil from outside the coil, because it's actually coming from the spinning bar magnet, creating that gyroscopic action of magnetic AC field surrounding the bar magnet, being shared with the magnetic field of the coil, which is being charged by the DC battery pack. So originally, the coil is creating not little gyroscopes, as Newman claims. It's creating a DC waveform to project outside itself and engulf the magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet. And those two magnetic fields blend and then send the blend back to the source that originally sent the energy of each respective field. So when you get this thing properly set up, as my simulations have taught me, you only have a sine wave occur manifesting as voltage exiting the power supply that's powering, in the case of the simulator, powering the power that's in a bar magnet that's retained there. It's like an electret. You know, it's like a battery because it's got stored energy. It's a permanent magnet. But it's not energy that's normally thought of as energy that we can utilize, but we can once we set it in motion. Now we've got a moving magnetic field which can move current in a wire. So it can be said that, potentially speaking, the magnetic energy inside a permanent magnet is electrical energy if we set it in motion. Let's see. So that covers gyroscopes. Now, the reason why the coil has to be so large is to create a voltage amperage, is to create this dipole. Because if it weren't so large, there'd be no dipole. So it's not only there to isolate the two poles, you know, the energy of the spinning magnetic field from the energy of the battery, but it's also to create the dipole. Now, how do we do this? Well, it's very common knowledge. It's called a step-up or step-down transformer. And that's how the coil acts. It's one of the two windings of a transformer. An isolation transformer is normally 1-to-1. But any transformer isolates. If you don't short out the two coils with each other, which normally you don't do anyway, I just have to say that because sometimes the power company likes to do that with the transformer outside our building. They like to short out the two coils. Why? You're not supposed to do that. That's not even safe. You're supposed to isolate. Oh, whatever. According to Eric Dollard, that's what they're doing. It's a weird new policy of the power company. Anyway, be that as it may. So the purpose of the coil is to isolate the battery from the energy of the spinning magnetic field. But when we make the coil massive, we create a step-up transformer in the direction of the battery pack coming from the spinning magnet. So that means you get an increase of voltage on the coil, higher, potentially, depending on how you tweak this thing. You can get it higher, double. You can get it double. I think Newman got it triple. In my simulations, I reduce it, the voltage below what the battery pack is creating. But in his actual real-life model that he built, various models, he would either get twice or 3 times the voltage appearing on the coil with respect to the voltage coming from the battery pack. So if the battery pack supplied 300 volts, he might get 600 volts or 1,000 volts appearing on his coil. That's because it's a step-up transformer in the direction of the battery pack, in other words, towards it and away from the spinning bar magnet. So I guess since everything Newman does is in reference to the battery pack, I'll have to reverse my statement and say that it's a step-down transformer. Be that as it may, it's done so. Did I say it right? Right, step-down, because moving away from the battery pack, that's exactly what happens. That's why the energy I supply to my simulated spinning magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet is extremely low voltage of just a few hundred microvolts, because that has to comply with what Newman has set up. He has set up a condition in which the coil is a step-down transformer. That's why it has to be so large, because he's stepping down the voltage coming from the battery pack. As it moves away from the battery pack and is sent to the coil, it now has to be stepped down in order for the amps on the other side, within the context of the spinning magnetic field, to be stepped up. And that's to take advantage of what magnetic fields are good for. They're not good for voltage. They're good for only one thing, amps. And so he has to have a high voltage coming from the battery pack, step it down just before it reaches, just as it's reaching the spinning magnetic field, so that the spinning magnetic field's high amperage as it is can be taken advantage of and boosted even higher. And thus we get a dipole because of a step-down transformer situation created by his massive copper coil. But the gyroscopes, they come from the spinning magnet. And the purpose of the massive size, the massive mass of the copper coil is to create a step-down transformer and thus create a dipole and maintain it, because he maintains isolation between the two different energy sources, the battery pack and the spinning magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet. Those are energy sources, and that's why the third aspect of Newman's claims that is false is that it's over unity. It's not, because he's blending two different energies, and he simply never takes into consideration the energy of the spinning magnetic field of the spinning bar magnet, and neither did Dr. Hastings. So they're both claiming falsely that it's an over-unity device. This is wrong. This is a lie. But Newman was lying to himself. He was a sincere guy. He's a country bumpkin. And Dr. Hastings never simulated, in order to analyze. They had computers. He could have simulated it, but he didn't think to do it. Or he wasn't told to do it by, Newman. Maybe he wasn't paid to do it. Whatever. I simulate it because of my personal situation. I have no money to build anything, and I have no background to prevent myself from getting electrocuted if I wanted to build anything. So I don't. I play it safe, and I simulate. And it really tires people. Build it already. No. Because if I keep simulating, I'll keep making a better model that'll far be superior to what I started out doing. And it is. It's evolving slowly, little by little. There's so many ways of tweaking this thing. I have to give myself time for the back end of my brain, the subconscious, to keep working on this and keep, okay, now try out this now. Try out this. We tried that. It didn't work. Okay, now try this out. So today I have a new idea to try out. In my bid to try to turn this mechanical advantage device into an electrical advantage device, something Newman couldn't do, because I understand the dipole. I understand it is a dipole, and I understand all these other things I've already said. So I understand it in ways that even Dr. Hastings didn't understand or appreciate. Certainly not Newman. And because of that, I have a more fuller, richer understanding of this thing, but I have to share it with you because I don't like to see these wrong notions being bandied about. Some of which, they're not wrong, they're just not very well educated. They're not holistic, they're not entirely accurate. They're simple-minded notions made up by a simple-minded fellow who couldn't think in any other terms other than simple. Now, I have no formal training in electrical engineering or physics, yet the fact that I'm self-taught means I don't have to play anybody's rules of policy. It has nothing to do with the rules of physics. You can quote other rules of physics to back up your claim, whatever claim you want to make, just like a lawyer, choose a different law to back up your position. And the judge has to integrate all of this, or the jury, to make sense of it all. Because each side is only telling a part of the story, a part of the whole story. And this is the problem with the antagonism that people have with the renaissance in electrical engineering that we are on the brink of, but corporations like to keep a lid on it because they would go out of business when we can create our own energy from a small input and magnify it, just like any good amplifier will do. It'll magnify energy by taking advantage of something that you don't have to pay for. They already made the magnet, and it's going to last more than a century if we take good care of magnets, permanent magnets. So that's an energy that's only cost once up front and will last you a long time, a lot longer than the battery pack that's going to age much more quickly because they don't bother to engineer batteries that last longer. They want us to keep coming back and give them the business, when in fact they could lose the business and make batteries that last easily a century or more, just like the permanent magnets that they make easily last a century or more. See what I mean? So it's not our fault that batteries don't last and we have to keep replacing them, even if they keep getting recharged or never drained at the very least. They just don't want to give us long-lasting batteries. They call them long-lasting because they're not. If they were, they wouldn't have to call them because it would be self-evident. Anyway, that's an advertising gimmick, is to call something new and improved when it's not. Because if it were, you wouldn't have to call it. Everybody would say, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. You wouldn't have to tell them. Oh, God. To help them make up their mind. Word of mouth would do it. You'd have automatic advertising just by word of mouth. Hey, get this. It's so cool. It's new and improved. And I'm not paid to say this either. Instead, they have to pay advertisers to say it because it's not true. Okay. So, did I cover everything? I think I covered most everything in a generic fashion. And meanwhile, you're looking at my feet and my kitchen table. Yeah, it's important to say these things so that we understand them and so that we can make improvements, because we'll have a firm foundation instead of just treating it like it's some kind of codified religion that will never change. It's because we don't understand it. There's no mystery. If we thoroughly simulate it, then we'll see all the moving parts and see where all the energy is coming from, and it is not over unity. I have to stress this over and over again. Yet because people don't believe me. They think, oh, what are you talking about? Of course it's over unity because you can't get energy from a magnet, but you can't have over unity because it defies the laws of physics, so the thing doesn't work, the whole thing's a lie. They're doing their own burial. They're burying themselves karmically because they're burying the device because they don't want to understand it. They don't want to simulate it. Oh, that's not realistic. You can't. The simulator is not an accurate depiction of the real world. Yeah, duh. But it's a generalization of the real world, and you have to account for everything to make it work the way Joseph Newman claims it works in other ways. Or actually, not Joseph Newman, Dr. Hastings. Negative current shows up at the battery pack. Newman didn't know that. Dr. Hastings found that out. And if you make sure that happens in the simulator, you have to account for the energy source of the magnet. You can't just leave that out of the simulation. And then you see it's not over unity, because you're getting an extra energy source in addition to the battery pack, and it's the magnet that's spinning. And Newman set it in motion. He started it spinning with his hand. So, that's an input too. But, Hastings never talked about that, and we never talk about that either. But it's important, because unless that barn magnet gets started either by an electrical start motor, that we have in our cars to start the engine, because it can't start on its own. So rather than go outside the car and hand crank it like in the old days, your great-grandfather might have done, we get a starter motor to start the engine in our internal combustion engines. Well, in Newman's case, he hand cranks it. But you could put an electric motor and hand crank it to get it started in the beginning. And of course it doesn't need a flywheel, because the massive magnet is its own flywheel. So you don't need a flywheel. That would be superfluous. Anywho, I think I've covered just about everything. And then some. I've covered a little bit of our misunderstandings, as well as Newman's misunderstanding, and Dr. Hastings as well. Their underappreciation of what they were looking at. And so we have inherited that underappreciation, and so it becomes a codified religious belief that either you believe in it or you don't. Well, I only believe in the sincerity of that country bumpkin. Country bumpkins do not make good con artists. You have to have a city slicker do that. A country bumpkin can't get away with it. They're too stupid to get away with a con job, to con anybody. And the fact that the patent office, makes it look like they were conned, isn't good enough. Because you know why? They were the only ones who make that claim. And the rest of the government agreed with them. But that doesn't mean the rest of the government was conned, because only the Patent Office and the National Bureau of Standards dealt with Newman directly. Everybody else in government dealt with Newman indirectly by way of what those two agencies claimed. They were dealing directly with Newman's device. And it turns out Newman had some supporters, and they may have disappeared from the scene, but that's only because Newman was squashed. That's the only reason why they disappeared, but be that as it may, that's my claim. No facts to cite to back it up, unless you want to believe in me. But he did have a few backers who stuck with him. Before he ever went to the patent office, it was them who pushed him to go there in the first place, because they saw it was working. You have to kind of wonder why he managed to con them, and they were not sleazeballs, like a TV newscaster, You can't get away with that sort of thing and last long in that business. Not on TV. Maybe you can get away with it in the old days of radio because you couldn't see anything to verify what was going on. You had to take somebody's word for it. But a TV newscaster who shows up on the scene and takes the report and is stupefied in wonderment at what he is seeing, that he can't believe what he's seeing at first. I mean, Newman made a believer out of him. He wasn't a believer to begin with. He was a skeptic. That's why he went there in the first place, was to, put on the air the denouncement of Newman. And unfortunately, he couldn't do that. He said, well, I don't know, there's some stuff happening here I don't understand. It's not supposed to be like this. Because they didn't understand where the second energy source was coming from. They thought it was all coming from the battery. They all got duped by their own collective stupidity. It wasn't Newman's fault. Nobody is taught to think that a permanent magnet is a source of energy. It's a potential source of energy, yes, but it can be actualized by setting it in motion, and that was an external energy source that set it in motion. His hand could have been a starter motor. So we're not analyzing the situation at all accurately, holistically. We're being inaccurate because it's not holistic. And this is what a simulation requires of the person. You have to account for everything to make the simulation work. In the manner that Dr. Hastings said, negative current arising on the battery pack, which batteries cannot do unless they short themselves, which of course a dry cell battery is not capable of doing usually most of the time. A nickel metal hydride will do that very ably if you run it down, only if you run it down. Then it'll short itself. But a dry cell battery doesn't do that, by and large. Unless there's, some malfunction of the membrane that separates the two dry cells from each other, it never does that otherwise. It simply loses its voltage potential between its two terminals. So for a dry cell battery to exhibit negative current is an impossible feat on its own unless the circuit is imposing it by pumping amps in greater than what's coming out, so that the net overall flow of amperage becomes negative, but it's really two different amperage flows, and it's just that the one coming in overpowers the one coming out, and you end up with a net negative polarity on that battery pack, because it's a blend of two different flows. Okay, and also a blend of two different voltages, but that doesn't mean the voltage necessarily, the net overall voltage is going to be negative. That depends on how you tweak the circuit, as what I've found out. It can be either negative or positive. In my case, I think I tweak it to become negative, and I don't try to go too far, because the way I figure, if it's a little negative, that's good enough. Yet I would end up wasting energy to try to increase the absolute magnitude of that negative voltage. Or the negative amps for that matter. And Hastings said it was only a small amount of current appearing on the battery pack in its negative polarization as it is. So, that's the kind of thinking. If you don't overdo it in your attempt to negatively polarize what was originally a positive condition, then you don't waste energy. But you do want that switch of polarity to show that, well, he's recharging the permanent magnet too. But so if you could imagine a magnet losing energy, which it normally doesn't, it doesn't get drained in that sense. It only ages over time, just like the batteries will age over time. But he is pumping, or my simulation is pumping negative volts back into the bar magnet, which is kind of a novel idea. Does that mean it'll last longer? I don't know. We've never done long-term studies like that. That would be an interesting study. But that's what's happening in my simulation at the current version of 15. So that simulation, you can find it by using the shortcut URL of is.gd/Newman, numeral 15, and then either JPG for the JPEG file or ASC for the LTC file. The LT Spice file. So you can run the simulation without having to craft it by hand just by looking at the image. That'll take a lot of time. Let's see what else. And those files were over at the archive.org. I have posted those files at. And that shortcut to that location, it's called Chapter 6 of Newman's book, but the shortcut URL is is.gd/Newman chap numeral 6, NEWMAN CHAP, and then the number 6. Okay.